Woodrow Wilson came to power in 1913, and with his ascension to power, not only did he attack the triple wall of privilege, which we talked about last time, but he proceeded to change, or at least his propaganda espoused the changing of of American foreign policy from Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy to William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson proclaimed a new way, and he called it moralistic diplomacy. And over the course of his time in office, especially those first few years, beginning in 1913, he would work to establish a new tone in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, all throughout Latin America. But historians debate and differ, and usually it depends on their political ideologies as to how effective Wilson's new moral tone actually was in foreign policy. Woodrow Wilson is going to dispatch troops, just like Theodore Roosevelt and just like William Howard Taft. Woodrow Wilson is going to follow the tenets of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that we're going to intervene to keep you from intervening. And he sends the Marines into Haiti. He sends the Marines into the Dominican Republic and maintains Marines in countries all around the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. And so it's debatable as to whether he really did set a higher moral tone with foreign policy, or if it was just a retread of past diplomacy. But where we really see a new approach is with regard to the revolution south of the border, a revolution that takes place in Mexico. Beginning in 1911, President Porfirio Diaz, who had been the president of Mexico, one of the longest serving presidents of Mexico in Mexico's entire history. Mexico has had an inordinate number of presidents over the course of its existence from the 1820s on. But President Porfirio Diaz is forced into exile in 1911 and is replaced by a liberal, President Francisco Madero. Madero has 2 years in office, and revolutions begin against his administration, and in 1913 he's assassinated. Now, how does this affect the United States? Well, 1913 is when Wilson's coming into office. He's new in office. He has to make a grand statement about the change of American policy. And here you have a revolution take place south of the border. Add to that, while criticizing dollar diplomacy, in Mexico, U.S. businesses had sunk well over $1 billion in Mexican industry, especially Mexican oil fields and Mexican mineral deposits. Add to that, there were some 50,000 American citizens living in Mexico that were placed in jeopardy by a series of revolutions. And with the assassination of Madero, President Victoriano Huerta comes to power and begins the rule of a dictator, a moderate dictator, but a dictator nonetheless. Woodrow Wilson, in making a statement against what he saw as an immoral ascension to the presidency, declares that the United States will not recognize the government of President Huerta, in essence breaking off diplomatic negotiations and diplomatic relations with our countries south of the border. This set off a wave of migration into the United States, tens of thousands of Mexicans fleeing the revolution, moving across the Rio Grande into the United States. And of course, this led to a call for action against these migrants moving in. We've already talked about how the progressives were anti-immigration while being pro-immigrant. They were anti-immigration. And so Wilson's forced to take action. And Wilson supports Huerta's rivals who are attempting to bring him down. The incident is given a much grander scope when the United States is involved with Mexico in the Tampico incident. The Tampico incident. A U.S. ship visiting the port of Tampico sends sailors ashore to gather water, to gather supplies, and resupply the vessel. And while these crewmen are ashore, the Mexican Civil War is taking place just miles away, and the American sailors either blunder or enter purposefully. You get arguments both ways, but enter a restricted zone. They're arrested, accused of spying, are thrown in jail. Now, chances are good that they, in fact, were engaged in spying because the Huerta government was becoming intimately involved with Germany, and the United States was interested in what arms and supplies Germany was getting from what Mexico was getting from Germany. So there is a good chance that this Tampico expedition of 8 or 9 men weren't just gathering supplies, but were also gathering intelligence, gathering information. Either way, they're arrested and thrown in jail, and the Admiral Mayo, demands not only their release, but that Mexico honor the United States with a 21-gun salute. Now, the rub is that to honor the United States with a 21-gun salute would require Mexico to raise the American flag on Mexican soil, fire off the 21 guns, and then, of course, lower the flag. Huerta refused to raise the American flag on Mexican soil. And so, although he orders the release of the sailors, gives an apology, he refuses the 21-gun salute. President Wilson takes the opportunity to order the fleet to Veracruz, and you see on the map where Veracruz is in relation to Tampico. Veracruz is the entrepot, the entry point for all invasions of Mexico. Anybody who wants to invade Mexico lands at Veracruz because it's a simple march inland to Mexico City. Cortez did it, Winfield Scott did it, the French did it. So Veracruz is the primary port supplying Mexico City. Wilson dispatches the fleet to Veracruz to seize the port and to force Mexico to honor the United States, but also to prevent the SS Ipiranga from landing in Veracruz. The Ipiranga is a commercial ship on its way from Germany filled with ammunition and guns to the Huerta government. Wilson had proclaimed an arms embargo against the Huerta government, and in fact was giving arms and supplies to Huerta's chief rival, Venustiano Carranza. So the U.S. fleet arrives in Veracruz. The primary two battleships you see, the Florida and the Utah, begin bombarding the city of Veracruz. The damaged building you see on the bottom is a high school that was right next door to the Mexican Naval Academy, which was the primary target, but stray shells hit the high school. and then ultimately the capture of Veracruz. Huerta, in defense of Veracruz, there weren't many Mexican troops. In fact, Huerta orders Mexican troops out of Veracruz and instead empties the prisons and arms the prisoners to fight against the Marines as they land in Veracruz. And after a short, vicious fight, the Marines capture Veracruz and hold it to prevent the Ipiranga from landing. While the United States occupies this primary Mexican port, if there was anything that could bring order out of chaos within the Mexican government, it's the United States interfering and occupying Mexican soil. And while the United States occupied the port of Veracruz, a revolution takes place yet again, and Huerta's chief rival, Venustiano Carranza, overthrows Huerta and seizes the government and becomes the head of the government. With a friendly person in power, the arms prevented from landing, Wilson needs a way out. That way out was provided by the ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. The ABC powers offer to negotiate between the United States and Mexico. Wilson takes the opportunity, and in July of 1914, with Carranza safely in power, Wilson withdraws from Veracruz and restores Veracruz to Mexican control, seemingly having found a way out. Unfortunately for Carranza, his two chief lieutenants, Emilio Zapata and Francisco Pancho Villa, both become rivals now to overthrow the Carranza government, claiming that Carranza was hopelessly corrupt and that either one of them would make a better president. They both try to bring down the Carranza government. And while there was substantial truth to the fact Carranza was corrupt and anybody else would have been a better choice, Wilson had a way out, and his support of Carranza had given him that way out. He recognizes the Carranza government and cuts off all arms and supplies going to especially Francisco Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa takes this personally, and he decides to, if the United States isn't going to pay attention to him, he will get their attention. And so he begins irritating the United States along the border. The first incident will occur at a place called Santa Isabel, either spelled with an I or a Y, Santa Isabel. After attacking a border town and having a number of his followers shot because of electrical searchlights that a U.S. company had installed in the city and providing power from a hydroelectric dam that Americans had constructed, Pancho Villa decides to specifically attack Americans. And so he stops a train coming from Santa Isabel, the Mexico Northwestern Railway, which was filled with ASARCO mining engineers. ASARCO, the American Smelting and Refining Company, which was an American company operating in Mexico. He stops the train and removes 18 Americans from the train and executes them. When there's no real response from the U.S. government, he decides to take a more direct approach. And in March of 1916, he crosses the border and attacks Columbus, New Mexico. In an early dawn attack, Pancho Villa, with a couple of hundred riders, assault the town, and you can see the damage inflicted on the town, setting fire to a number of buildings. Unfortunately for Pancho Villa, Columbus is very near an army base, and the U.S. Army reacted far quicker than he anticipated, and so he loses a large number of supporters. Over the course of the next few months, Pancho Villa is going to launch a number of attacks along the border. Most of them aren't officially credited to them, but there is a large body of evidence to say that he was involved. So he gets American attention by way of Uncle Sam desiring to put Pancho Villa down. And so with the permission of the Mexican government, President Carranza gives his support to Woodrow Wilson to send a punitive expedition, a punishing expedition into Mexico to chase down and bring Pancho Villa to justice. And so Woodrow Wilson chooses as the leader of the expedition to chase Pancho Villa, he chooses General John J. Blackjack Pershing, who had come to fame in the Spanish-American War. He's known as Blackjack because he was an officer who led the Buffalo Soldiers, black troops, earning his nickname. By the way, he followed in his father's footsteps in a day and time when white officers did not relish leading black troops. John Pershing requested the assignment and had fulfilled it quite well. So he was Woodrow Wilson's choice as leader of the punitive expedition, if for no other reason than to provide a distraction for Pershing. Pershing had just suffered the loss of his wife and children in a house fire. And so Pershing will lead around 5,000 Americans, maybe as high as 6,000 Americans across the border to chase Pancho Villa across North Africa. So beginning in 1916 through 1917, Blackjack Pershing will pursue Pancho Villa, never capturing him, never bringing him to justice. But as a historian, I don't think that was really the point. Woodrow Wilson is going to run in 1916, run for re-election, and he's going to run on a platform of, he kept us out of war. But as with most politicians, Woodrow Wilson was being disingenuous. I think this 1916 punitive expedition was all about giving the U.S. Army training on operating with modern equipment in a foreign country at the end of a long logistics line. And so you see here in the punitive expedition some of the new approaches, the use of trench war, the firing line entrenched, a change from the linear block tactics of the Civil War, the United States being quicker to learn about the use of trenches than Europe because of the Civil War. But you also see the Curtiss Jenny airplane, so use of air power primarily for scouting. The use of truck convoys along with horses, wagons. So it's really a transition period for the U.S. Army, departing from the old way of doing things that we had even done during the Spanish-American War to a more modernized and mechanized type of war, which we'll get into the mechanization of World War I next time. And so I really think the punitive expedition was all about training, all about preparing the Army for entry into World War I, even while Wilson was telling the American people and running for re-election on a platform of, he kept us out of war. And so the punitive expedition, while not effective in catching Pancho Villa, did give the Army some training, which the U.S. Army will be the core of the expanded Army fleshed out by the National Guard, and that will be the American Expeditionary Force that ultimately goes to Europe. So while the United States is dealing with the Mexican Civil War and the crisis across the border and the results of that, in Europe, the world had exploded in flames. In the summer of 1914, the world changed. As one of my colleagues will say in her European history class, it will be the end of the ancien regime, the end of the old order. Everything changes, and we can still today feel the effects of the results of World War I. Europe loses the cream of its manhood. National borders and national rivalries and national hatreds will be uncovered that still to this day have not been put to rest. And it didn't happen overnight. This had been building for decades. You can see in World War I the rivalries of the French and the Germans that go back to even before Napoleon, but especially in the day of Napoleon, in which Napoleon had conquered Prussia and the German states and humiliated Germany by forcing them into the Napoleonic order. And then with the defeat of Napoleon and the restoration of Europe, Germany's fractured government was brought together in the 1870s by the Franco-Prussian War. In that war, Germany, desiring revenge for what the French had done in the Napoleonic War, Prussia is able to defeat Napoleon III, not to be confused with Napoleon the Great, but Napoleon III is destroyed. His ability to wage war is destroyed, and France is humiliated in the Franco-Prussian War. And out of that conflict, modern Germany is born. Most Americans don't realize that. Germany is not a very old country. Up until 1870, Germany was a collection of principalities. Only in the 1870s do they coalesce into a unified nation that we can call Germany. Before that, Germany was more of a locale rather than a nation. This had been building, though, from the 1870s and the exacting peace forced upon the French at the Franco-Prussian War, the harsh reparations and demands that the Germans place upon the French so embitter the French toward the Germans that France even preserves the train car in which the peace had been signed, looking toward the day that they can exact revenge. And jumping ahead to the end of World War I, when the fighting comes to an end and an armistice is signed, that armistice is signed in that same train car, brought out of a museum and hauled to the front lines because the French know they're going to humiliate Germany with this peace. And so in 1914, decades-old rivalries that had been building and bubbling to the surface, as one author calls this conflict, he calls it the long fuse, in which powder after powder after powder was added to the keg of gunpowder that it just needs a spark to set off. It had almost happened in the early 1900s, but Theodore Roosevelt and the Moroccan crisis had negotiated in the end at the Algeciras conference, had negotiated a pause, a respite. But as Robert Massey says in his impressive book on the coming of World War I called Dreadnought, he says Europe would not be deterred. They continued to arm and equip and prepare for a conflict that was unleashed with the events of the summer of 1914. We just celebrated last year, and America didn't pay much attention. We have other things to stew about, but the 100-year anniversary of World War I's beginning in Europe was last year. So in the summer of 1914, the heir to the Austrian throne was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a reformer of the highest variety. He was a reformer and an insightful politician that was looking toward the day that his father, Emperor Franz Joseph, would step aside and he could bring reforms to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ferdinand was not only different in that he wanted to reform the empire, he was different in that he married what amounted to, yes, an aristocrat, but an aristocrat commoner. She wasn't, according to Austro-Hungarian law, she wasn't eligible to be empress because she was not of royal blood. She was of noble blood, but not of royal blood. But Franz Ferdinand loved her, and so he married his wife Sophie, and they had numerous children and had quite the storybook love affair. In fact, their time in the palace in Vienna was so beset by those who fought and attacked Sophie that they looked for every opportunity to get away. And so Franz Ferdinand, the future reformer and lover of Sophie, traveled in June of 1914 to Sarajevo, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they traveled to Sarajevo to make an official visit, but more importantly for the emperor, the future emperor and empress to have some time away, the heir apparent and his wife to have time away. There had been numerous hints that there would be an assassination attempt on the crown prince. In fact, the picture you see of them leaving City Hall. On the way to City Hall that very morning, one of the group of assassins scattered around Sarajevo going to attempt to kill the Archduke that morning. An assassination attempt had taken place. One of the assassins had been standing in the perfect location as the motorcade passed, and as you can see, it's an open vehicle, and he had pulled the fuse on a hand bomb and had thrown the hand bomb at the vehicle, but he didn't throw it hard enough, and it bounced off the folded up roof covered in the tarp that you can see on the back of the vehicle. It had bounced off of that and exploded under the escort vehicle behind, killing and injuring a number of the Crown Prince's escorts. And in fact, his compassion is going to cost him his life. As you see him exiting the City Hall here, this is about 5 minutes before he and his wife will be assassinated. As he's getting into the vehicle, he orders them to change their travel arrangements, and instead of going to the next established stop on his tour of Sarajevo, he orders them to take him to the hospital so he can see those who were wounded in the vehicle that had had the bomb explode behind him. Well, someone didn't communicate this to the driver. And as they leave the City Hall and proceed down the road, the Crown Prince realizes they're going the wrong way. He tells the driver where he wants to go. The driver stops, and they begin the process of turning the motorcade around. Sitting at a cafe right where the motorcade makes its turn was another one of the assassins. He had given up hope and was sitting there drinking coffee, Gavrilo Princip, when he sees the motorcade and it stops right in front of him. He gets up and pulls out a machine pistol, and the first shot he hits Sophie. The second shot he hits the Crown Prince, and Franz Ferdinand throws himself across Sophie, begging her with his last breath not to die, even as Princip continues to shoot him. The Crown Prince will die, Sophie will die. Gavrilo Princip, unfortunately for the world, does not die. All the assassins were chosen because they had terminal illnesses. Most of them had tuberculosis and were looking forward to a painful death. So they had volunteered to attack and assassinate the Crown Prince in hopes of preventing him from becoming emperor. Serbia was interested in preventing the Crown Prince from becoming emperor because his reforms would have placated the various nations ethnic groups that composed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if that had happened, then the ethnic Serbs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire would not have wanted to return to Serbia, and ethnic Serbs might have wanted to immigrate to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So to keep friction stirred up between the two, they assassinate the Archduke. Princeps had a false tooth that he clicked out. He bit down on the cyanide capsule hidden in that false tooth, but somebody had not checked the expiration date on the cyanide capsules, and when he chomps on it, he makes himself sick, but it doesn't kill him. And so Gavrilo Princip was captured. He was taken to police headquarters. The Sarajevo police, in intensive interrogation, and by that I mean if he knew something, he told it before they were done with him. They did not use the Miranda rights. They used probably rubber hoses and anything else they could find to bring the truth out. And what Princeps revealed was that the Serbian government was behind the assassination attempt. And so the Austrian government rounds up the other assassins and brings them to trial and delivers while they bury Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, who Sophie was unloved necessarily in the Austro-Hungarian Empire while she was alive, but she became a usefully loved martyr in death. I've seen what ensues often described as a bar fight, and rather than explain that bar fight to you, I'll put it in my terms, and please understand, I'm simplifying for the sake of understanding a very complex treaty structure. The Austro-Hungarian Empire delivers to Serbia an ultimatum, in essence saying, you, in your attack on the Crown Prince, have insulted us. This is the end of a long line of insults, and we demand the following list of concessions that amounted to Serbia surrendering to Austria. Serbians are ethnically Slavic, and they refuse to knuckle under to the ethnic Germans of the Austrian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they refuse the demands. Or as the author of the very humorous story says, Serbia bumps into the Austrians in a bar and sloshes a drink on the Austrians' clothes, on the Austrians' pants. The Austrians, in reparations, demand an entire suit of clothes. Serbia says, while we may be responsible for spilling the drink, we will only buy you a suit of pants. We're not going to give you a whole suit of clothes. Austria then says, we'll make you. The Serbians, being ethnic Slavs, appeal to another Slavic nation, and you can see the connection even in their flag. Serbia appeals to Russia, and Russia and Austria have a long-standing history of disagreements, especially border disputes, and Russia says, you're not going to pick on our little kinsman, Serbia. You mess with Serbia, you're messing with us. Now, Austria isn't necessarily afraid of Serbia, and they know they can take Serbia, but Russia's a different story. Russia's about as backwards of a military nation as you can get, but there's a lot of them. And when Russia mobilizes, Austria cannot stop the Russian masses. So Austria, Emperor Franz Joseph, appeals to Germany, their ethnic kinsmen, and says, hey, we got a little issue with Russia. Are you going to come to our aid? Are you going to help us out? And so as Franz Joseph of Austria and Tsar Nicholas II, the autocrat of all the Russians, debate on what they're going to do. Then the real hothead, Kaiser Wilhelm II, gets involved. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany tells Russia to back off. You're not going to pick on Austria, or you're going to deal with us. Well, Russia, who knows they can take Austria, isn't so certain that they can take Germany and Austria. So they activate a treaty alliance that they had already established with France. And you can see by looking at the map, you can see why France would be interested in a treaty with Russia in case they ever have future problems with Germany. Think Franco-Prussian War. After the Franco-Prussian War, France had worked out a treaty with Russia that if they ever went to war against Germany, that they could tag team Germany. And so Russia says, France, do you have our back? The French President Raymond Poincaré and Prime Minister René Viviani say, you betcha, back off, Germany. If you pick on Russia, you're messing with us. But France isn't so sure they want to tangle with Prussia, or in this case, Germany. And so they appeal to yet another nation that they have treaty relations with, and that's Great Britain. Britain, we've got a little issue coming up here. Germany and Austria look like they're going to do something with us and Russia. Where do you stand on the issue? King George V, who, by the way, is cousin to the Tsar and the Kaiser, says, you guys are crazy. We're not getting involved in any conflict between you guys. We're going to sit this one out. The only way we get involved is if anybody should mess with Belgium. Belgium is the only nation in Europe that England has a defensive treaty with, that if anybody messes with King Albert of Belgium, Britain will declare war. Unfortunately for Great Britain, unfortunately for Belgium, unfortunately for the Western world, that's exactly where the German War College had planned their primary attack. You see in the overview, which we'll get into in greater detail next time, the attack from Germany, rather than going through the heart of France, and especially the intense forests and fortifications along the French-German border, the German war plan, called the von Schlieffen Plan, called for an assault through the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, to reach France. Von Schlieffen said that if enough divisions were sent in a sweep along the English Channel, around France's defensive fortifications, and France then could be assaulted directly from the west or the northwest, France would fall. In other words, Paris could be captured from its undefended side rather than going through the heart of the defenses. So Germany's first great miscalculation is, we can take France, but to do it, we have to go through Belgium. When they do that, Britain comes into the war. And with Britain entering the war, this becomes a bloody stalemate, with the trench lines not changing much from 1914 until the end of the conflict. And so in the summer of 1914, with the countries all dressed up and ready for war, Europe celebrates mobilization, and the war begins. Now that the war has begun, the United States is going to be caught in the middle, and they're going to have to decide what to do.